My name is Sarah Handler. I'm a product manager here in the security engineering organization at Netflix. I lead our product management function for all of identity and access for everyone that helps Netflix to entertain the world.
All right, and my name is Ian Haken. It's my first year at Identiverse, and I am a security software engineer at Netflix in the security engineering department. I've been there for about 8 years, working on different infrastructure, architectural security tools for our enterprise. But for the last year or so, I've mostly been working on rolling out our passwordless authentication story to our workforce. So that brings us to the question, why did we engage on this effort of rolling out passwordless? So I probably don't need to tell most people in this room about all the benefits, and there's like 30 other talks here about all those benefits, but I think it makes sense to be really explicit about the goals of why we're putting so much effort into this project. So the state today, or the state before we even got started, all of our workforce had two-factor authentication. So they had a password, and that's a knowledge factor, and they had possession through a push notification in order to be able to log into SSO. And so that part of it we didn't necessarily need to change. They already had two factors. And in the long run, ideally we go passwordless and we can replace that knowledge factor with something like a biometric. But the bigger goal that we wanted to achieve with a passwordless rollout is that all of our factors should be phishing resistant. So whether that's the biometric or a knowledge factor and that possession factor, being phishing resistant is really the end goal, and passwordless is sort of a means to an end for us. And so there's a bunch of different technologies that exist for passwordless, especially if you were in here for the last talk. They talked about a few things like, soft tokens and there's also like email magic links. These are things you can use to authenticate without passwords. But what we really want is the phishing resistant technologies. And so as we started down our passwordless journey, we had to pick which technologies we actually wanted to use. And so there are a few things in this like Venn diagram intersection at our disposal. All right, and of course, the last goal, I almost forgot to mention it, is that we do want to roll this out to 100% of our workforce, which is globally distributed. Many of them are fully remote, and it's northward of about 13,000 people. So, okay, I mentioned we had a bunch of options at our disposal, and so we wanted to pick which ones our users should ultimately be using. So first option at our disposal, security keys. Those have been around and pretty popular, growing in popularity for something like 5 or 6 years now, and we really like them. They've got a great mental model for our users as well. You can literally put them on a keychain, and people can think of them as a key that they need to get into their account. It's easy to understand where that thing is and how to move it between devices. But on the downside, it's a physical piece of hardware. It is something that we have to get into users' hands and ask them to not lose. And when you get to the scale of like 13,000 people, like the cost becomes kind of non-trivial as well. So it's something to consider. And of course, the second option at our disposal is Passkeys. Everyone's talking about Passkeys. It's an option now, and it's not on the screen, apparently.
They're so groundbreaking, they're off the slide.
Yeah, it's awesome. Trust me, Passkeys are on there. So Passkeys are great. They don't have that hardware requirement because it's using the hardware that's already in people's hands today. But the downside, when we kicked this off a year ago, that we sort of discovered as we went along, is that Passkeys are a rapidly evolving ecosystem. And that's like good in a lot of ways. It's improving as it evolves, but it means that there's a lot of changes for us to keep up with. So on the left is what it looked like when we were having users add Passkeys right at the beginning. You just like get this Touch ID prompt. And on the right, now you've got a screen of things to choose between. And like more choices is good for the most part, but it means we're constantly updating our docs. And when a new Chrome release drops, we have to go like race and update all of our docs when people come and ask us questions. So that's sort of not great. And then there's cloud synchronization. Better for like not getting locked out and getting your passkeys on new devices, but a lot of people had questions on whether that's what we want for our enterprise authentication. And then besides those two things, there's also a lot of other phishing-resistant methods that are available today through proprietary and vendor options. So I'm not going to go through all of those. Like, go explore the expo hall. There's lots in there. I encourage you to learn about them. And they've also got a lot of pros and cons. A lot of them work where WebAuthn doesn't, and spoiler alert, WebAuthn still doesn't work everywhere. But these can really fill those gaps. That being said, there's mixed support for uncommon platforms. A bunch of our developers use Linux as their daily driver workstation, so if it doesn't work there, then that's a big gap in our technology choices. And compared to something like passkeys, especially security keys, there's a lot less end-user familiarity with those proprietary options. And so that's a hurdle that we'd have to address if we wanted to choose some of those. And
Definitely.
Sarah actually has more to say on that last point.
I do. Speaking of end-user familiarity, it was really important for us before we got started, before we did pilot 1 and shows what factors you're going to use, to understand what our users understood about these technologies. As Ian mentioned, we already had two-factor authentication widely adopted across our workforce. So unsurprisingly, when at the end of 2022 into 2023, we polled a bunch of our employees, most of them knew what it was. Most of them are familiar with 2FA, if not someone who felt like they're an expert in it. But then we started asking about WebAuthn, or strong authentication, or the phrase phishing resistance. Most of them had no idea what that was. A few of us nerds did, and I tried to tell my team not to fill this out, but some of those greens were in fact our team. And then when you look at something like Passkeys, it's even less, right? Most people had never heard of it, or a lot of people hadn't heard of it. Most maybe had heard of it, but wasn't quite sure. We also know sometimes people say that they've heard of it, just they don't feel left out. I think if we were to ask a lot of them to define it in any sort of way, they would have no clue at that point in time. Fortunately, and interestingly, YubiKeys did have a fair bit of awareness. A lot of folks didn't feel like an expert, but they had at least heard of it before, because we already had YubiKeys in some pockets of our organization. All right, so we took all this data, and we said, what should we go do first? Well, it was important for us that we did not get mired down in all the challenges that we'll talk about more in a moment, and that we figure out the path of least resistance for our first users. The first thing we wanted to figure out is, what does success mean for us? There's many different reasons to adopt phishing-resistant authentication. One of the biggest ones to us at the outset is A, that it obviously makes us more secure, and B, that it's going to simplify the sign-in process for our users. So for our early pilots, we were really focused on finding the highest risk users in our organization and moving them to phishing resistance. That was part of our success criteria. We did a lot of testing with our early adopter groups, and we set the expectation with them that this is going to be a little bumpy. We're trying something new. It's not going to work perfectly all the time. You're probably going to hit some rough edges, and we'll literally give you a sticker for it. We also had to decide where we wanted to do this. We were at an interesting point in our identity journey where we have our in-house, heavily customized IDP, but also evaluating some other more cloud-based options, and we wanted to decide, what do we need to build ourselves versus what could we leverage that was out in the market. We also at Netflix have an interesting culture where we give our employees a lot of freedom. We try not to force them to do a bunch of things. So we had to find the balance between enforcing this migration for users, especially who pose more risk to Netflix if compromised, while also allowing what we called opportunistic enrollment, where if you heard about this, we let them enroll, even if they weren't in the pilot group. And lastly, we wanted to lean in to what was going to be really persuasive for these various audiences. Our first pilot that I'll talk about in a moment was called the Simplified Sign-In Pilot. It did not use the word WebAuthn. It did not use the word passkey. It did not even say passwordless, because at that time it was not. Really focused on the fact that it would simplify sign-in, and in some of the other messaging, how it would make them more secure. All right, so let's talk a little bit about our first pilot, simplified sign-in. And this is where we use our homegrown MFA provider to have about 40 users enroll a passkey or a YubiKey as their second method. So these users did still have a password. That was still their first factor. We just moved to a non-phishable second factor. What was interesting is nearly 3/4, or more than 3/4 of these pilot users thought that responding to MFA prompts was strongly or somewhat better than what it was before. Now, for most of these users before, and a lot of these high-risk users had to MFA multiple times a day, they had to go find your phone, which if you're someone like me, is the last thing you want to do in the middle of your workday to improve these MFA prompts. So this made it a lot easier to just MFA right from their device. It was also not super disruptive. We saw the vast majority of users, it took less than 10 minutes to enroll. Those of you who may be thinking about your own rollouts, a few things to think about. We did a pretty broad communication campaign where we'd sent multiple emails to let these users know that it's coming. And on the graph on the right, you can see there was a jump in enrollment every time we sent an email. But we didn't get to the finish line just on a proactive basis alone. Eventually, we did enforce these users to enroll, where they hit an enrollment screen and they couldn't sign in to anything else until they enrolled. So we'll show you what this looks like. Let's see if it's going to play for us today. All right, so this is our quick little enrollment UI using our homegrown IDP. They come in, they authenticate with the old provider, they tap their fingerprint, and they're done. Now, this is a little sped up, but it really did not take that much longer than this for them to enroll this. We only had them at first enroll one additional factor. We leveraged what we already had to get it out quick. So this really was do something a little quick and dirty to get our users safer.
Wildly bare bones and basic is what you get when you ask me to build a UI. It's not a good idea.
It was very beautiful, Ken. It was beautiful.
But so this first pilot, even with only a few dozen users, gave us a lot of good information about what we should be thinking about as we try to roll this out to more people. The first is that creation of local passkeys on each device turned out to be fairly important. As you saw there, what we had people do was like enroll a passkey on their laptop. Through sort of like minimal amounts of friction. But the first thing we started observing is in the days that followed, everyone came back and it's like, how do I sign in on my phone? I can't sign in anymore. And we realized that the enrollment process really needed to be making sure that you had a passkey on each device you're going to use. Of course, if you create a passkey in something that's cloud synchronized between devices, like that doesn't happen to people, but like that might not be the option they click. So we really have to guide people through doing the right thing and making sure they've got it on each device. And this is also really important because that means that you then have a passkey on each device so that you don't end up getting locked out. Because something else that happened is someone left their laptop at home, they wanted to use a loaner, but like their phone, which is normally enough, plus the password in their head, wasn't enough to like get into a loaner machine. So having multiple passkeys, or at least a synchronized passkey on each device they were going to use, was something that we needed to make sure was part of that enrollment process. The other thing that we discovered in the days that followed was a bunch of the corner cases of things where like WebAuthn and passkeys don't work, either because it's something in a WebKit embedded view. So when folks were setting up new Mac OS devices, it turns out that if it's pre-enrolled in device management and they hit that MDM login screen, that doesn't support a security key. We had lots of in-house stuff that was hard-coded against the old MFA provider to send pushes, and that was still happening even though they were on passkeys. So we had to discover a lot of those things. And there's also weird stuff with like people sharing devices and having a common login where they can't use, Windows Hello or like Touch ID passkeys because it's all the same login. And we had to discover a lot of those things. And so proactively identifying those and resolving them, but also having a really quick go-to like exception path was really important to make sure that we didn't end up in this place where productivity was impacted and we started developing a negative reputation around productivity and the hassle of this effort.
Definitely. We really tried not to let perfect be the enemy of good here. So we did this first pilot, we learned some things, and we decided we wanted to try out passwordless enrollment, full passwordless enrollment, leveraging an actual IDP that was not our own. So what we did is we took about 80 users, another fairly risky 80 users that our security folks identified for us, and had them enroll in being fully passwordless. So this meant either passkeys, YubiKeys, or this provider's proprietary but not WebAuthn-based phishing-resistant authenticator. The results were fairly similar to pilot 1, but a little bit better. This time we saw 80% of users saying that it was somewhat or strongly a better MFA experience, and we saw about 3/4 taking less than 5 minutes to enroll. What was really exciting here is I think, we all work in identity. Who's ever complained to you as an end user about identity and login? I think all of us have heard complaints. Who has told you that your work was life-changing, right? That does not happen super often in the security and identity space. So it was really cool to see some really, really happy users. We got this feedback from Slack where folks were encouraging others, even who weren't in this pilot group, to go enroll because it was such a significantly better experience than signing in with their password and with the push-based notification. So this was some really exciting evidence for us that we are onto something and should keep going. All right, so let's talk about our decision factors.
So yeah, going back to the question of we've got these different technology choices, we gave people options in these pilots, which ones do we actually direct people towards using? Ultimately, there were a few things that informed our decision. One was that hardware distribution problem turned out to be really big. For this worldwide workforce where some people are fully remote and we don't have a way to preemptively ship them something, where we have to tell them, you have to come request something so that we can then ship it to you, it ended up being a big problem because the amount of time that would take was time where we had to accept the risk of those users potentially getting phished. So that was probably the biggest decision factor for us. The proprietary options, we ran into those issues of universal platform support, so it might be good to have those in our back pocket, but maybe not the number one recommendation for all of our users. And ultimately, the friction for enrollment. The fact that passkeys work on the hardware you already have. You don't have to know about how to plug the thing in. These USB-A users are still turning it upside down, trying to figure it out. Like, you don't have any of that with Passkeys. So the outcome was that we had a sort of strong opinion about like going passkey first for our users, but giving people the option to use whichever of these makes the most sense for their use case. So strong opinions, weakly held. Let people do what works best for their setup.
Definitely. All right, so now it's time. We've gone from these little pilots, our little risky users have all enrolled, and now we need to figure out how to scale this to the entire workforce. And there are a few lessons here that we learned along the way. Some we anticipated and some we did not adequately anticipate. The first is not assuming that our pilot users are going to be representative of the entire workforce. And that showed up in a few different ways. A, the users that had been enrolled in the pilots were risky because they were largely fairly technical users with access to a lot of high-risk things. They did not represent the average user that might be in marketing or in legal, who may not have as much familiarity with just like sign-in in general. So we did a lot of research. We worked with a fantastic designer in our security engineering organization to go and take our proposed UX, which we'll show in a moment, and get their feedback on it. And we learned a lot of the language that we all use to talk about authentication is not familiar to them. So we had to make it a little bit more user-friendly. The second is collaboration. We would not be standing here on this stage today or signing in with Passwordless if we had not collaborated with our support folks, our internal comms folks, as well as our security teams. Internal support is going to be your best friend if you let it, right? They're going to be on the ground hearing the friction that users are hearing and having every single day. And they were really great folks to vet some of our ideas by because they can anticipate what types of questions our users are going to have. We really wanted to treat the user experience here as a first-class consideration. We did not want to be that mean security team that is making you go do that thing that kind of sucks, but you got to do it for security. We wanted this to be as delightful as it possibly could be. I think delight is an underutilized aspect to a lot of our user experiences that we really wanted to imbue in the Passwordless enrollment because it is delightful to sign in with just your fingerprint or a glance of your face. Lastly, and something that we still continue to learn, is just how much of a mental model shift this requires. A perfect example of this is before, when we used push-based notifications, a user could reach out to support to verify that it was working. And support would do that by sending a push notification to their device. You can't do that. By design with Passkeys, you can't do that, right? So even ways that users verify that it's working are going to be different in this world. The new device onboarding flow, as Ian alluded to earlier, before all you needed was that push-based notification and to remember your password. But now you have to use another device to bootstrap this new device. It's different, and there is a learning curve for our users. So user education, not just about how this technology works and what it means, but how to use it, is incredibly important to your success. The last one is a passwordless question mark, because we all know that using passkeys does not necessarily mean there is no password involved. You might still have that device password or your device PIN. And this, again, especially as we've expanded the rollout, has been a really confusing topic for our users, right? We tell them, hey, you're moving to passwordless, but the second they close their laptop lid and they need to authenticate, what do they need? They need that device password to unlock that passkey. And so I think the passwordless branding is something perhaps as an industry we should work on here because it is confusing for our users. You know, once we explain the difference between an SSO password and a device password, they at least sort of get it, but it's not the most intuitive. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at what we built here. So one of the biggest challenges, there we go, during our rollouts here were that there are so many possible permutations of devices that a user can have. And each one, we're going to have slightly different recommendations of what factors you use. So for instance, if you're a user who uses a MacBook and an iOS device and they have the same iCloud account, you only really need to enroll one passkey. But if you're using a Windows device plus an iPhone or some other combination, we had them create 2 different local passkeys. So this is our enrollment UI. There are a few things that we iterated on that I would highly recommend and have worked well for us. The first one is to set the expectations of not just what steps they're going to take, but how long it's going to take. We had some users who underestimated how long the process would take. They would abandon it midway through, and then they would get in this weird middle state where they were stuck and couldn't sign in. So we made the expectations really clear on the left. We told them what would happen during this experience. And we told them what they would need. So we told them proactively, hey, you're going to need all your devices. You're going to enroll them together today. We also wanted to give our users the option to defer. But we didn't just want them to give a snooze button and never see it again. We wanted to make sure they would remember to actually enroll. So this button that we created on the bottom left actually creates a calendar invite on their calendar that includes all the information they need to enroll. And we have this hooked up with our enrollment system where it makes sure that that date is ahead of the date that will actually be enforced, which is really cool. Big props to the engineers who built that. All right. And then to show you a little bit about how we got the information about their setup is we had this little quiz where they came in, they told us about their setup, and at the end it spit out a recommendation based on their configuration. So this did take some work on our side to actually figure out this branching logic, but it's made a huge difference. Prior to this, we had a 20-something page Google Doc, which was perhaps not the most fun experience for users to figure out exactly what options they needed to do to enroll. So this is a big improvement. They're only seeing the information that's relevant to them. All right, so one other thing that we've had to do, but might make the steps that y'all take a little different than ours, is adapting it to your culture. As Ian mentioned before, we had strong opinions weekly held here around what methods they should use. So we're leaning into the cultural value of freedom and responsibility by giving them options, right? If they want to use a YubiKey, go right ahead, even though we try to tell most users a passkey is probably going to be easier. We also need to be ready to handle situations that are going to be unique to your culture or maybe where you're geographically located, whether that is challenges in terms of procurement for things like YubiKeys or just the culture of how they share feedback. Certain of our offices are going to be really vocal if they're having a hard time. Others will never hear from them unless we explicitly ask. So thinking about the culture, especially geographically, is important. And also think about where users are throughout time. We have a lot of users who have a kid and take a very well-needed and deserved many months-long leave, right? If they're not going to be around while we're doing this rollout, how do you handle them? So think about the cultural nuances of your organization. We also worked a lot with our legal folks who are fantastic around biometric concerns. Kudos to the FIDO Alliance and others for having really good public documentation on how the biometric doesn't leave the device. But what we knew and what we continue to learn is the second you say biometrics, some people get a little worried. So make sure they have a plan for that. We've really emphasized in our UX that that is optional, that you can use that PIN or password if you prefer, though it might not be as fun of an experience. And the last big one is having informed captaincy for decisions. It's a concept that we use at Netflix, but I think can be applicable anywhere. Make it really clear who's ultimately making the decisions and is responsible for gathering all the context you need in order to make a decision. The last thing I'll note is I like to have a little fun. So I thought it was really important that we have stickers because anyone in security knows people love stickers. So we created some fun designs. If there's anyone from Google in the room, the so long for thanks and all the phishing, we did get printed 2 weeks before your blog post with the same title. So we did not steal that from you. That was an independent idea from one of our folks in our support organization. But it's important to have fun, right? Like I think it can be easy to overlook how much fun something like stickers or swag can be, but it really does make a difference. All right, so with that, let's talk about what's next.
All right, so what's next? We got our users on Passwordless, but it was bumpy. There were a lot of things that could be a lot better. I've said this a few times, like there's still a bunch of things that don't support WebAuthn, and it's become the new, does this product support SSO question for us? I have actually been pleasantly surprised that we had a conversation with a vendor we were considering where we discovered we couldn't sign in with the passkey in their mobile app. And not for security reasons, but the folks in charge are like, it's too much hassle building a workaround. That's going to create friction for our users trying to use this. We don't want your product. So they actually said, no, we'll fix it. But it is becoming increasingly important. If you develop native desktop mobile apps, there's an RFC for how to do it. It's 7 years old. You don't need to be using embedded web views. It's fine. Platform authenticators, they are still a little bit bumpy. Trying to set up a new phone with a Google Work account where you need to sign in with a passkey for that work account, there's a weird chicken and egg problem. It's bumpy. You got to do workarounds. Said it before, Mac OS has problems with the out-of-box experience, and Linux users are getting left behind. There's no platform authenticator there. And so, that's unfortunate. Visibility around cloud synchronized keys for enterprises is still not quite there. I've been having a lot of good conversations the last couple days. Good stuff is coming, so I say that, but I feel like this is already almost solved. Enterprise IDPs that support WebAuthn and Passkeys, WebAuthn is evolving so fast, and there's so many knobs under the hood that keep getting added really quickly. IDPs need to expose those things more readily because it's not great that there's all this info about the fact that it is cloud synchronized, but I can't see that through the IDP that I'm using. And the last thing I'll just say is like standardization around like the modals and the naming. Do you create a passkey on a security key, or is a security key something you use instead of a passkey? Like there's weird differences in a lot of the dialogues we've seen over the last year. And like many of them say biometric authenticator, which for people that don't have a biometric on their device then becomes really confusing. All those bumps said though, like this has been fantastic and our users are delighted. And I just want to end on this note.
Yes, again, we had less than half an episode of Bridgerton to get through all of this, which is a lot of content, so we are at time. But make it fun, right? Like I think unbridled joy, again, how many other things are people going to say that about? And along with stickers, do not neglect the power of custom Slack emoji in driving this. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be outside if you have questions, and we'll see you next year.